on that initial night that they did strike. We know right now the president, per his public schedule, is meeting with his national security team in the Oval Office. We have watched members of his national security team, including the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, make their way into the West Wing as we anticipate more from the White House and this administration on their reaction and next possible steps, as the president has warned.
And I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, you were actually at this very base just over a month ago when President Trump went to visit. This is a critical base for several U.S. operations in the past and expected to be in the future. What do you make of this, Iran now announcing that they're attacking it?
And it is the largest U.S. airbase in the region, obviously positioned critically. And the president was there just a few weeks ago on May 15th. I was there. This was during his first big foreign trip, his first trip in the Middle East as well. And at the time, it was interesting, the president speaking to thousands of U.S. troops there. And at the time, he said that it was his priority to end conflicts, not start them. But he added in those remarks that he will not hesitate to wield American power if it is necessary. The president at the time saying, when we are threatened, America's military will answer our enemies without even thinking about it, overwhelming strength and devastating force. That was the quote from the president during that speech. And it gets to this question of what comes next. We know that the president, as Rachel was just saying, has cautioned and warned Iran that if they don't reach peace on his terms, that the U.S. will respond in kind with that same kind of skill, precision, and force that he warned about in that speech over the weekend. I think obviously it was expected that Iran would respond in some way. Certainly that is what the Ayatollah has been telegraphing. Now it appears they are doing just that. The big question, how will the U.S. Then respond, given the kind of rhetoric and language that we have heard from the president? Certainly this is going to be what the president is discussing this afternoon with his national security team.
And we are, a U.S. official is now confirming to ABC News that Iran has in fact fired missiles at Qatar. I do want to try to bring up that video again that we're seeing from inside Doha. It looks like you can see those missiles coming in through the night sky there. This again is the largest military base in the Middle East, also has played a critical role in several conflicts. This is the video from inside Doha. Again, it looks like you can see those missiles coming in targeted at the largest U.S. air base in the Middle East. I want to bring in Ann Flaherty for a little bit more on the logistics here. Ann, what does it mean to have an attack on this base?
Yeah, so we were just getting word moments ago that a U.S. official does confirm that, in fact, Iran has fired missiles at Qatar, believed to be targeting that Al Udeid Air Force Base that we have mentioned. That is the center of the air operations for U.S. Central Command. It's a very critical base. About 10,000 troops are believed to be stationed there. U.S. officials also tell us that, look, you know, they are prepared for this. They knew that this was a risk when President Trump had ordered that attack on Iran's nuclear sites. So they had moved equipment, assets into the region precisely for this scenario. So they are expecting this to some degree. They will say that there are, air defenses that Qatar has. It is able to protect itself in that airspace. But a lot of concern in this building right now about U.S. troops being targeted in this attack.
And U.S. troops around the Middle East are now being told to shelter in place. Our James Longman is in Iraq. And James, what are you seeing and hearing there, and what does this mean for troops in the region in general?
Yeah, look, it's a big moment, Diane. Everyone here knew that something was coming, and I think perhaps there was a sense that there'd be a few days, perhaps that maybe the Iranians would sort of think about what they were going to target, that it was going to be at a time of their choosing. We hear that phrase so often. Now these early reports about Qatar and the Gulf, probably the more obvious choice, given these are integral to the U.S. operation in the Middle East and have been in the post-9/11 era. Closer to Iran, though, we did imagine that they'd be striking into places like Iraq, with the Ain al-Assad base here, which has been a target for Iraqi militia time and time again, allied to Iran. There are some 40,000 U.S. troops all across this region, some in those bigger bases in the Gulf, but others at much smaller outposts in places places like Iraq and in Syria as well. The United States said earlier this year they wanted to reduce their footprint in Syria, take it down to about 1,000 troops in Syria. I don't think they're there yet. They will not have, most likely, the kinds of defences that a bigger airbase in a place like Qatar will. And people at home may remember in 2020 where Donald Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, head of the Quds force. After he was killed, the Iranians themselves, not their proxies in Iraq, they struck the Ain al-Assad base inside Iraq. And so that was seen as the Iranians hitting directly at the Americans rather than using a proxy. This time round, though, they have fewer proxies at their disposal. Yes, there are still militias in Iraq that still function broadly in the way that they have been before the Hamas attack on October 7th, but other proxies really have been degraded. If you just look at Syria, which sits between the two countries, of course, Bashar al-Assad, really a key ally of the Iranian regime, would help the Iranians move weapons and supplies between Iran and Lebanon, where, of course, the other major proxy existed, Hezbollah. That's still in place, but Hassan Nasrallah, again, has been wiped out by the Israelis in this post-October 7th era, which is extraordinary if you just think about the number of Iranian allies who have been neutralized since that Hamas attack. The knock-on effect of that attack has just been unbelievable. And so the Iranians now do not have a Bashar al-Assad in Syria to rely upon. They do not have as much a Hezbollah empowered in Lebanon to rely upon in order to employ these proxies to hit the Americans. And so they have to do it themselves. We are yet to know the extent of this attack. Look, it's been it's understood that perhaps the Iranians have used up to half of their long-range missile capability. That's the kind of capability they would need to use to strike places in the Gulf. But their rockets, their attack drones, they still have plenty of those in their arsenal, and they're still able to strike at targets closer to home. I'm talking about Iraq, where I am, and in Syria too. So look, we'll see the extent to which the Iranians really want to strike back. They will want to show their audience at home that they are doing something. By definition, the Iranian regime defines itself in opposition to the great Satan of America, the smaller Satan of Israel, to use their phraseology. So they will have to show a public about whom they are afraid. Let's make no bones about it. There have been massive protests in Iran. They will want to show them that they are doing something. They won't want to do too much, because that would risk their own survival. Diane?
And Ian, how are they trying to ride that line, particularly in their messaging now?
It's had two statements, one from the Iranian Air Force and another, more importantly, from the Secretariat of the Supreme National Security Council. This is a governing body for matters of national security, as the title suggests, but it's also presided over by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, at least in normal times. Let me read you part of this statement. Whoever attacks you, attack him in the same way as he attacked you. In response to America's aggressive action and brazen act, the Islamic Republic of Iran destroyed the U.S. airbase in Al Udeid. Well, that's clearly probably not going to be the case, and we have to wait and see what damage was inflicted on it. But interestingly, they also say the number of missiles used in this quote, successful operation was the same as the number of bombs that the U.S. had used in attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. So, I mean, this is a clear tit for tat. As I said earlier, I was in Iraq when there was retaliation by Iran for the assassination of General Soleimani. That was a calibrated response. And if they fired an equivalent number back, that might also be construed as a calibrated response, but that lies in the hands of the Trump administration. They've already put themselves out there as saying any reaction will be met by an even greater response. As James says, I think it's right. I think the regime has to portray strength domestically. It's under huge amounts of pressure. It's in disarray. Many of its leaders have been killed, and there are questions being raised about how much power they continue to exercise. So it will do that. It will also be succor to their supporters throughout the region. Don't forget, at Friday prayers last Friday, we saw large-scale demonstrations, tens of thousands of people gathered around the Arab world in support of Iran. And this will also send a message to them, as well as, of course, to Iran's proxies. Just to go on to Iran's capabilities, what Israel is saying is Iran started with something in the region of around 8,000 of these ballistic missiles. Now, it's not saying it's destroyed half of those. What it's saying is it's destroyed half of its capability to launch these missiles. And that is an important distinction. Israeli officials that we've been speaking to also say there is a bottleneck in its ability to fire back. But as James says, certainly places like Qatar are close enough for them to be able to fire like this, as is Iraq and as is Syria.
And Ian, we're now hearing from the Qatari Defense Ministry. They say that the Qatari air defenses successfully intercepted a missile attack targeting Al Udeid Air Base. Again, that is the largest U.S. air base in the Middle East. This news from Qatar comes after Iran had announced that it had launched that attack. I want to bring in our chief foreign affairs anchor, Martha Ratitz. Martha, you've spent a lot of time in this region. What do you make of this announcement now from the Qataris saying that they successfully intercepted this attack, and what does that mean for future retaliation?
Well, I've actually been inside that base there in Qatar, and the command center, the heart of air operations, really the heart of the region for the U.S., that air base. I am frankly not surprised they successfully intercepted the missile attack, because they do have air defenses there in Qatar, in the air base there. And what I've heard from the Iranians is not a surprise at all. They are going to claim, as Ian and James have both said, they are going to claim that the missile attack was successful for their domestic audience. They have been crushed in the last few days by Israel, by the U.S., and they have to, in many ways, save face. And I think that's a real issue, Diane, too. What do they do now? How do they respond going forward? It's exactly right. In 2020, it was a calibrated attack on Iraq. Ian was in Iraq at the time. I was in Iran, reporting there behind enemy lines, essentially, when they launched those missiles toward the airbase in Iraq. And that did leave 100 troops with mild traumatic brain injury. But they didn't follow on with anything. I think one of the reasons they didn't follow on is because they accidentally shot down a Ukrainian commercial airliner, or they might have continued their attacks. But I also think we really have to watch Iran still. They still have capability, and they may have taken out 50% of missile launchers or a good deal of the ballistic missiles, but they still have capability. And if they keep those missiles coming, if they aim for Iraq, if they aim for Bahrain or other bases, they're bound to have some success. And just go back to what President Trump has said in the past. He has very much said that the U.S. would respond with strength. And the U.S. and Donald Trump are certainly in a position where they would have to follow through with that threat as well.
And I want to bring in Colonel Stephen Ganard into the conversation as well. Colonel, to Martha's point, what is Iran's next move now if Qatar is saying that they were able to intercept this missile attack on this U.S. airbase there?
Yeah, Diane, I think the most interesting thing that I've heard so far is that Khamenei said that the number of rounds that they fired at Al Udeid, and maybe perhaps to other U.S. bases in the region, was limited to the same number of bombs that the U.S. used. So the minimum you could consider would be 14. There were a lot more dropped than that. There were 30 Tomahawk missiles. So we'll see how they count. If they count at 14, when they could be counting somewhere up around 70 or 80, then we'll know that this was clearly just, I have to do this, and I'm going to aim it toward you, or I'm going to lose my credibility here and lose the regime. The other thing that's interesting here is we've watched the videos that are coming out of Doha, Diane, is you'll see a lot of lights in the sky, a lot of missiles in the sky. So both the Patriot and the THAAD, it's a shoot, look, shoot doctrine, and so you'll see two Patriots coming up to every inbound missile. So it's not that there are that many inbound missiles; it's that you're seeing the fire doctrine of those THAAD and Patriot batteries is to shoot two for every one incoming to make sure that they hit that missile. Another point I think that's interesting here, that obviously part of the calculus for Iran was that if they're going to shoot at other countries, even though those are U.S. bases, they are shooting at Qatar. They are declaring war on Qatar. If they shoot at UAE or KSA, it's going to be declaring war on those countries. They know that. in a sense, this makes life easier for the United States, because before we had to move in lots of naval power because we didn't want to have to ask permission of countries who didn't want to get involved. All those countries are now involved and will probably more than likely to be happy to have U.S. forces very apparent and perhaps even striking Iran from their air bases, since Iran has struck them first.
And we can actually see now some of those explosions over the sky in Doha, over that U.S. military base. And now we're hearing that President Trump is meeting with top advisors at the White House as we speak. Rachel, what more can you tell us about those meetings?
Well, Diane, I could tell you that we knew that this was a meeting that was on the president's schedule initially. It was supposed to be happening starting at 1 p.m. here at the White House in the Oval Office. We are now told that this meeting with the president's national security team has now been moved to the Situation Room. I was told by a senior administration official not too long before we came on the air, as we were hearing about these strikes, that the president and the White House, the Department of Defense, were closely monitoring any threats to any of our troops, including at this air base. So now we are told by a senior defense official right now that Secretary Hegseth, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Canes, are currently in the Situation Room meeting with the president. And as you can imagine, one of the things that they are going to be mulling over in this moment right now is how the United States is going to respond to this. Yes, they were anticipating some of this because Iran, in the lead up before the president even made a decision on whether or not he wanted to strike, was very forceful in their warnings to the United States, making it clear that strike would be met with strike, that war would be met with war, blow with blow. They warned that repeatedly. And the president, after giving the green light, moving forward with this military strike over the weekend, then put out another warning to Iran, telling them to come to the table, that diplomatic options are still available, that they want to explore diplomacy with Iran. But he did send out that very firm warning, saying that future attacks would be far greater and a lot easier. During the Pentagon press briefing over the weekend, we heard directly from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as well as the Secretary of Defense. They reiterated what the president said in his social media posts and also to the nation, warning of against retaliation to Iran. They said it would be in poor choice, in poor favor. But right now we know the president is still inside this meeting in the Situation Room with his national security team. Diane.
Meanwhile, James, Iran must be considering their next move as well. And it's not just military. One of the big concerns is that they could close the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, that's right. They know full well that if they decide to cause a blockade, to mine it in some way, that could disrupt global trade. Some 20% of the global oil supply passes through the straits there. So they know that that's a big, big move on their part. It probably would affect more the Europeans and Asia than it would the United States necessarily. But Donald Trump was keen about this particular possibility. He was actually messaging today on Truth Social saying everyone should keep oil prices low to play into the hands of the enemy, he said. You know, there's what Iran does, I suppose, as spectacle, as theatre, and I would suggest perhaps that shooting missiles at an airbase in Qatar, which it likely knows most of those missiles will get shot out of the air. That's the kind of thing it can sell to its domestic audience. Cutting the Strait of Hormuz, that is real economic pain it can inflict on the world, and that would ratchet up the pressure even more. Likely then to get those European leaders who were trying desperately at the 11th hour to try to get in the room with the Iranians to try to get a deal before Donald Trump ordered that strike on those nuclear sites. Obviously, that didn't go anywhere. I would imagine if the Hormuz Strait was shut, that would get those Europeans back trying to push for a diplomatic solution as quickly as possible. So, look, this is still early days. We don't know if the Iranian attack will stop with Qatar. We've heard speculation that there could be other bases around the region struck. We know that Iran has form hitting bases, for example, in Iraq, where I am now, as I was telling you just a few moments ago. So it's early yet to see what Iran is going to do. Diane?
And we did report last week about aircraft being removed from that airbase as a precaution. So it sounds like the U.S. was prepared for this retaliatory strike, even if it hadn't been intercepted.
Yeah, that's right, Diane. I mean, all U.S. officials knew that this was a possibility that Iran would have to attack. It would have to strike back. As Martha was saying earlier, you know, this is almost a face-saving move that they feel that they have to go through with, of course, a very dangerous one. And last week, as you mentioned, we did report that that base had moved nearly 30 military aircraft They've gone to other bases as this precaution. We also know that they've sent another aircraft carrier into the region, that these aircraft carriers can carry up to 60 fighter jets. All of that to help with any operation that might pop up to respond to these types of attacks, because of course, you know, everybody is very much on edge. They're very nervous because if anything were to get through and if an American were to be killed, you know, the speculation there is that President Trump would have to respond. And that's what has everyone concerned, because, you know, it goes from being this singular limited strike on Iranian nuclear sites, and then it moves into a wider war if there's this retaliation and back and forth and so forth. So, you know, a lot of this, the U.S. officials here say that they are hoping that everything, you know, that this is a one-off, that, you know, they can handle this, they can shoot these missiles down, and that calmer heads prevail. Diane.
Ian, is this response, now that Qatar is saying they intercepted it, still enough to satisfy that need for Iran to retaliate politically for them, or do you think Iranian leadership is still under pressure to do more now?
I think we have to wait and see. Do they attack U.S. bases in Iraq, potentially the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, where, interestingly, the Interior Ministry has advised people to stay indoors, seek shelter? That would certainly be a significant escalation. I think Anne's absolutely right. It depends what the report is on how much damage there is, whether U.S. personnel have been injured. But also a lot of it depends on the mood of President Trump. I think there's many people will feel this was suicidal by Iran. It's already beleaguered. It's had its key leadership killed. It's had its armed forces decimated. Israel now controls the skies. And although this may be face-saving, which shouldn't surprise us because there's form there, the response from the U.S. to this could trigger further events inside Iran. And you've got this real danger now of this going from what felt like a localized conflict into a more regional conflict. And we have to wait and see what the response is, not just of Qatar, but of other Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, and the response of the United States. But there are real dangers here. This really is dangerous ground, that this starts to become far more regional, and that will bring in many players. It will involve the popular mobilization units inside Iraq. It potentially involves Hezbollah, who have also been active again today, and there will be consequences. Now, if the United States and others continue to try and degrade Iran's abilities just from the air, that is one thing. But if anybody is starting to suggest anything more significant, then we're in a totally different ballgame. But again, let's just be patient and wait and see exactly what the impact has been. Let's wait to hear from the President and the Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But I would say for Iran and the future of the regime, if it didn't look tenuous already, it certainly does now. Remember, Israel specifically targeted the instruments that are used by the Iranian regime for suppression inside the country, the Basij, which is a kind of domestic security force that's used to enforce Iran's draconian laws, for example, against women, against protesters. They also targeted the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They also dropped a bomb near a prison, an infamous prison inside Iran, used to house political prisoners. And Israel's defense minister has made no bones of the fact that this is about unsettling the regime and its grip on power. And you also had that late-night posting by President Trump when he also raised the question of whether regime change would be bad. And as much as officially U.S. and Israeli officials want to ignore that, it's starting to become a more and more pertinent question.
And Colonel Ganard, how does Qatar go about repelling an attack like this and intercepting these missiles?
Dan, obviously for decades now, the U.S. has been interested in this region and considered Iran a threat. And so all of the Gulf states are tied in with the U.S. in very intricate, very sophisticated air and missile defense systems. So there are radars and links between countries that have radars. And so what we call the air picture over the Persian Gulf is probably covered like no other place in the world. So the ability to share that information, to share inbound missiles that are coming in, to be able to hand those off to various kinds of surface air missile defense capabilities is quite extraordinary. It's like no other place in the world where you have this much information sharing between countries. The missile systems like the THAAD and the Patriot can actually do what we've seen in Israel with some of their systems, and they can actually, as they track the inbound missiles, they can actually calculate where that missile is going to land. And if that missile is going to land, say, outside the fence line in a deserted area outside of Al Udeid Air Base, the system will not go after it. They'll just let it fall harmlessly in an open spot. They only go after, they calculate only those missiles that would hit either a residential area, an industrial area, a military base. Those are the ones they go after. But they have that ability to discern where the impact point is going to be and make a judgment on whether they should intercept that inbound missile.
And again, for anyone just joining us, we were looking at video from just moments ago of an Iranian missile attack on a U.S. air base in Qatar. The Qataris have said they've intercepted that attack, but we are, of course, waiting to see and hear of any damage there. This is the largest U.S. air base in all of the Middle East and has played a critical role in so many different conflicts, including Iraq, Afghanistan, strikes on Syria, and so forth. We are now, again, waiting to see the extent of the damage there, if any, but Qatar has said that they have managed to intercept a lot of that attack, if not all of it. And this could still play a critical role in the region. I want to go back to Colonel Steve Ganard, who's walking us through a little bit about how this attack was intercepted and the protections at play. Actually, let's go to Rachel Scott, who's been following the reaction from the White House now. Rachel, we know the president is in the Situation Room now meeting with top leaders. Given this attack was intercepted, if there isn't a lot or any damage for that matter to the base, how much pressure is on President Trump to respond, or could he let this go?
Well, politically, this puts President Trump in a very tricky position. The president has been very clear, very direct, that any response from Iran will be met with a far greater response from the United States. But remember, President Trump, as a candidate, campaigned on getting the United States out of foreign conflict. He described himself as a peacemaker, even in his inaugural address. And so you have had this split in the Republican Party. And the president, over the last several days, I was told, was getting a series of phone calls from Republicans on Capitol Hill on different ends of this spectrum about whether the United States should get involved. Some, like Senator Lindsey Graham, urging the president for direct U.S. involvement. Others cautioning the president against it, saying that the United States needs to take a step back here and can support Israel as an ally and a friend, but doesn't need to be directly involved. We know the president's calculus on this started to change. Sources tell me that U.S. officials started to realize that Iran maybe wasn't serious about coming to the table for these nuclear talk discussions. I was also told in the last several days by sources that there was this urgent last-minute attempt to try to get Iranian officials and also U.S. officials in one room, and that President Erdogan of Turkey was trying to broker this meeting, speaking with the president directly at the G7 summit. We know that the president then ended his trip to the G7 summit in Canada abruptly. He traveled right back here to the White House, and every day since then he has been meeting with his national security team and his advisors, going over any potential threats to the United States and also the next movements here. But again, the president was very clear about this. In addition to not only warning Iran not to retaliate against the United States, we also heard from the president on social media just yesterday talking about the possibility of regime change. The president saying that it's not politically correct to use that term, but he went on to say that if the Iran supreme leader cannot make Iran great again, why not consider regime change? I had a chance to speak to the White House press secretary earlier today, and I asked her, what did the president exactly mean by that? Is he calling for the United States to get involved to accomplish that? Is he calling for Israel to get involved to accomplish that? Or is he talking about the Iranians? And she was very clear with me that the president was speaking about the Iranian people, saying that it's up to them to decide if they want to rise up to tackle that regime if they don't come to the table for diplomacy, Diane.
Rachel, thank you. Annie, and I want to go back to you because we're now hearing the first reaction from Israel to this attack.
Yeah, that's right. This was a spokesman for the chief spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces, Effi Defrin, General Effi Defrin. He was asked about Iran's attacks on U.S. bases, saying that we're following developments that are being reported. We are in touch with our partners in the region. And, of course, Israel regards this as more proof of the violence, that Iran is a terrorist state that threatens not just Israel, but the region and the world. We're also hearing from Bahraini state television that they have closed their airspace. The Interior Ministry in Bahrain, which of course is home to the US Fifth Fleet, had essentially issued an order advising people to stay at home. Now, no indications that anything has happened there, but it's just worth reiterating that the concerns about what just happened in Qatar are not just felt in that country, but I think throughout the Gulf region. But again, just to be very clear, we need to know whether any of these got through. A US official speaking to ABC News has essentially said that the Qataris and the Americans were involved in the shoot-downs. They're also saying that they don't think any of those projectiles landed in Al Udeid Air Base. Interestingly, Press TV, which is the pro-Iranian or Iranian government television, is claiming that they did land there, but no evidence of that.
And what more are you hearing about the way these missiles were intercepted?
Well, again, this has come from U.S. officials. We know that the Qataris have basically U.S. air defense systems, and of course the U.S. base at Al Udeid has them as well.
And are other assets in the region as protected as this airbase is, or are they more vulnerable?
Well, this is an extraordinarily protected air base because this is the nerve center, as we've been talking about, for U.S. Central Command. So we know that the attacks on the Iranian nuclear facilities, the flights would have been coordinated out of this base. So it's a very, very critical base. And of course, you know, they don't speak to the security of other bases, but you can guess that this one is probably better protected than others. And that does raise concerns for other spots throughout the region. And we are just hearing, Diane, that there have not been any impacts with this attack in Qatar. We are hearing that they are not tracking casualties at this time. So certainly, I think many people are breathing a sigh of relief because the hope is that this will be contained and will not escalate further. But again, as everybody likes to say, the enemy does have a vote in that. And we don't, we have to wait and see how the Iranians calculate all of this, Diane.
And Rachel, of course, there are lives at stake. There's national security at stake. There's also money at stake here, particularly when it comes to oil and gas prices. How concerned is the White House about that?
Well, it's something that the White House is obviously keeping in mind and folding into their calculus as they're evaluating this ongoing situation and also tensions in the Middle East. But of course, the primary focus from the president and the administration is keeping American lives safe. And so the fact that the target here was our troops, our air base, that could possibly prompt a very sharp response from the president if he decides to move forward. And after warning consistently and repeatedly against retaliation, it does put the ball now in the court of the United States to decide how forceful they want to respond, also possibly knowing that Iran could respond again. And this is the type for tit for tat that many Republican lawmakers and even some Democrats warned about, that warned the president against. Yes, while the president has been adamant that he does not want to see Iran have any nuclear program or nuclear weapon, at the same time there was that campaign promise that he was going to be the mediator, that he was going to be the peacemaker as well. And of course, Diane, I will tell you, all of this comes amid ongoing questions about just how much damage the United States was actually able to do to Iran's nuclear facilities. We heard from the president saying that they were totally and completely obliterated, but we have heard from other members of the administration sort of distancing themselves maybe slightly from that language, maybe not being as strong when they've talked about what actually occurred in that military strike. Diane.
James, what are other bases in this region now doing to try to prepare for possible attacks from Iran?
Well, they've all been told, Diane, essentially to shelter in place. And some of them are very, very simple indeed. A few years ago, I visited one of the smaller bases in northern Syria. Now, there are U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq there as part of the effort to keep ISIS at bay. People will remember ISIS, the caliphate, once it once ruled an area that's governed a huge swathe of northern Syria and Iraq. Together with the United States and the Europeans and others, a coalition pushed those ISIS fighters back, decimated the caliphate, the Kurds on the front foot fighting alongside Arab forces as well. But there remain pockets of ISIS fighters across Syria and Iraq, and they remain, and American troops remain in Syria to try to keep those forces try to keep ISIS at bay, but also advise the local government in both cases in Syria and in Iraq on basically how to police the region. And actually just yesterday there was a suicide attack in Damascus that killed over 20 people, and ISIS, the Syrian government say, claimed responsibility for that attack. So ISIS is still very much a threat, nowhere near the same kind of threat that it used to be, but it remains a serious dynamic in this part of the world. And that is why US forces remain. Now, they are more kind of vulnerable to attacks than other bases, because these are just much smaller locations. We went to one of the bases in the north of Syria, and it was essentially just a large barn in the middle of a field. And yes, there will have been military installations around it, but this is not the kind of large air base that you may have seen pictures of in places like Qatar, or indeed a naval base in Bahrain. These are much smaller. So these US service personnel are essentially much more vulnerable to attack. We actually saw that in January of last year at Tower 22 in Jordan, where US service personnel were killed by Iranian proxies there, and the US had to figure out a response, which was in the end striking their proxies in Syria and in Iraq. So these are much smaller bases around this part of the world. That makes them more vulnerable. They're also much closer proximity to the Iranians. Diane?
Yeah, they're not all as well protected as Al Udeid. James, thank you. And we're getting a look at some of the flight radar over the Middle East right now. Again, many areas in the region are bracing for possible retaliation from Iran. And the Qatari officials actually closed their airspace just shortly before Iran announced this missile attack on the Al Udeid air base. I want to go back to our Ian panel in Tel Aviv. Ian, where does this attack leave us now in terms of this conflict in general, and watching for Iran's and the U.S.'s next move?
Well, I think at the time right now, it looks like a limited attack by Iran. A show of limited force, perhaps, one that will provide succor to the domestic audience, one that will allow Iran to save face and say, look, we responded against America in retaliation for the strikes inside Iran. I mean, of course, the reality is that there is no equivalency whatsoever in volume, and certainly not in impact. We have no reason to believe that any of those missiles that were fired, or rockets that were fired into Al Udeid or elsewhere in Qatar, were not intercepted at the moment. So this could well be a limited response, and therefore then attention turns to how the US then replies. As we saw back in 2020, after Iran retaliated for the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the response was limited. It did have an impact, of course, on those US bases, but it became the end of the matter. It was generally conceded that would be it. That it looks like where we are right now. But again, we have to wait and hear from the president.
And many now hoping that's the case this time around too, Ian. And we're now hearing from a U.S. official telling ABC News the Al Udeid air base was attacked by Iran using short and medium-range missiles. We have no reports of casualties at this time, and that official says the attack has ended. So we'll leave it there. We'll have much more on this later. Right now, we'll return you to your regular programming, but our coverage continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. And David will have the very latest on World News Tonight. I'm Diane Macedo in New York. Have a great rest of the day.